incredibly useful podcast. And I've got a lot of my clients onto them because the way that you can take research, take complex topics and make them very digestible, I think is one of your strengths for sure.
Yeah.
One of those episodes that I listened to today, Luke, was looking at the reading research and the 10 simple rules for reading a scientific paper.
Mm.
I want to get into that a little bit later in the podcast because I think what our podcast is all about essentially is unpacking a lot of the misinformation that's online at the moment. Something that Aidan really wants to talk about is, I guess, managing all these different social media platforms in today's day and age and how much media and content is coming at us. And so I think giving our listeners a little bit of ammo to help them unpack this information online is something that we kind of want to do today with this podcast.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good. I think, there is this sort of gap between researchers and then practitioners and then the end user. And so I think as coaches, we can often sit in that in-between space. And I probably made the mistake earlier on about trying to be too much like a researcher and talk in researcher language, if that makes sense. So, we have a really important role to play as being that bridge. So that's where I kind of view myself now. So that'd be really cool.
Cool. Before we jump into that, do you want to just give the listener, if they don't know you, a brief intro as to, how you ended up living in Sweden? Because we know you obviously started out in Australia, started as a PT in Australia. So a little bit about that, your journey.
Yeah, man. So I'm 36 this year. I started coaching people. I was a personal trainer when I was 18, and I was working in person in Sydney, big box gyms, Fitness First, that kind of thing for a while. During that time, I went back to uni and did a double degree, or I started a double degree in psychology and biochem, and then transitioned that into a neuroscience degree. And essentially got to a point in 2019-ish where the business was going pretty good, but we decided, my wife and I, that we wanted to go travel. So I took the business online and went overseas, and then the pandemic happened. My wife is Swedish, so we ended up just staying in Sweden, and here I am. So we ended up staying for longer. I had a kid here, this kind of thing. So yeah, just work online and sort of clients from all over the place. The main thing was sort of body composition and powerlifting related for most of it, but it does span a little bit now. People wanting to work a bit more on like their body image and working quite a lot with other coaches. They can sort of see my process. I mean, coaches need coaches too as well for their own training, and also just to, I suppose, educate them a little bit. So kind of runs the gamut in terms of stuff that I talk about with people, but it is, I suppose, more on that body composition powerlifting slant. Yeah, but it's pretty fun that way. It challenges me in a lot of different ways. But I think for me, my coaching styles evolved quite a lot from essentially trying to look smart to actually delivering useful information and being a little bit less about the nuts and bolts of like, these are the mechanisms of how things work, and a little bit more about how can we actually implement this? Because I think fundamentally everyone kind of knows the basics of how to do stuff. Like, hypertrophy training is not that complicated. Losing fat is not that complicated theoretically. You can make it quite complicated, but it's really the implementation and the context where it becomes challenging. So I think that's probably where I've evolved from the start of my career to where I am now.
And how would you, I guess, describe your own training journey? Because I know the priorities maybe shifted a little bit, especially over recent history, obviously having your first child. And I know you've talked a little bit about that on social media, reducing your training sessions, but I've seen some photos from a while back and you definitely put in a fair bit of work when it comes to hypertrophy at some points.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking back, I was a bit of a monster, I think. Like, I remember just not really being able to fit into many clothes and stuff like that, and finding it pretty awkward to move around, chafe thighs all the time, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think my sort of love for growing muscle and that kind of thing really waned probably in that 2018, 2019 period, just before we started traveling anyway, just because you kind of end up being like, well, what's the end goal here? But obviously traveling and then having the pandemic and then having a child sort of really impacted the ability to actually, even if I wanted to, train in that fashion. And so for me, it sort of came into finding a way to fit training into the rest of my life. And that's something that I do talk about quite a lot, is just having some clarity on your value, so you understand, how does training and nutrition actually fit into your life? What are you trying to do with it? And how does it leave enough space for other areas of your life that are important to you? Which I have quite a lot, to be honest. Like I sort of have a personal approach of trying to be a bit of a renaissance man. In other words, having a bit of knowledge about everything and having broad interests. And so when you think about it, if you're a coach and you started training at 18, it's like I got into it because I was obsessed with fitness. And so I'm someone who was, playing rugby. I was obsessed with going to the gym. I go to the gym when I'm 18. I'm hanging around other trainers. My social life is trainers. My hobbies are training and reading about training. You end up just getting quite one dimensional. And so, although in some ways now it's a bit like, oh, I can look back and be like, oh, geez, I was so big and strong and I had all this time to train and this kind of stuff. At the same time, I think you end up becoming much more well-rounded in everything that you do. And so, yeah, for me, it was about finding ways of making training more efficient and making it effective, despite the fact that I wasn't spending 10, 12 hours training extremely hard all the time now. And that certainly comes with having a kid. If any parents are listening, you know what I mean. You got to make it count when you can. And I think surprisingly, really, you can actually make a lot of gains and make most of your progress with surprisingly little. There's more and more research coming out on that. And my personal experience certainly reflects that. So, all is not lost. It's definitely not a case of like, you have to train 4 days a week for at least an hour to actually make any progress. That you can get away with far less than that, although it won't be optimal gains. It'll still be pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that's where a good coach and good programming can really come in handy, when you can make things as efficient as possible and ensure that what you're doing is of a high quality. And someone like yourself who has a really good understanding of programming, you could probably get a fair amount of work done in, it's 3 sessions in a week.
Yeah, no, totally. If you understand those principles, then like I think actually a lot of my programming is about just trying to make things as efficient as possible, because I personally don't see the point of spending, unless you have a preference for it, spending all this time in the gym and all this time thinking about training and nutrition, when you can kind of get 80-90% of the way there in a far more efficient time. Like if I can do the same thing in a half-hour session that would take me an hour, why wouldn't I do that? So it's been like a personal interest of mine that I've sort of pursued quite a lot from a research perspective, and then also experimenting with stuff in my clients' programs and in my own program. So yeah, definitely a philosophy of mine now.